Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
If we've got a confused relationship with nudity, as we've been discussing for 45 minutes, possibly more actually, it was a whole hour, who'd have thought? There's so much mileage. Then we've got an even more confused relationship with drugs. It's so long in this country, the drug debate has been led by people who know absolutely nothing about it. It's quite bizarre. I'm not suggesting you should put junkies in charge of drugs legislation, but they're probably going to have a better handle on how to minimise risk and danger and death than anybody who has no knowledge whatsoever of the issue. It's also, you know, again, it's one of those things that lends itself a little bit too easily to hectoring and barracking. I do think you don't need personal experience of every single thing to have an opinion on it. The old joke involves Morris dancing and incest, doesn't it? You don't have to have experience of those to have strong opinions on the two subjects. But generally speaking, certainly if you listen to this programme on a regular basis, you'll know that the best calls we get are from people who know what they're talking about. It's slightly unfashionable for phone-in radio to go down that path. But, you know, if you're going to talk about how something has impacted on your life, then you can tell me how it's impacted on your life, or you can read me something from the comment section of the Daily Mail. And you know, everybody with a fully functioning intellect, which is not as many people as we thought it was a couple of years ago, is going to lean more towards the person describing experience and reality than the person parroting stuff from the comment section of the Daily Mail. But on drugs, I do think knowledge helps. I do think knowledge is power. But I don't think I need to take spice to have an opinion on what it does to people. I can see what it does to people. I possibly need to be in a world where it is routinely taken to understand why so many people do take it, but it's not a huge leap of imagination to suggest that if you're homeless, then if the cheaper path to oblivion is going to be the most popular, even if it does render you a gibbering wreck, curled up in a puddle of your own mess in the bottom of a public phone box. So I guess, at risk of me sounding lazy, I'd like you to ring me and tell me something interesting, profound and informed about drugs, legal highs and legislation. 0345 6060973. There's a challenge for you to rise to. Dave's in Bristol. Dave, what can you tell us?
Interesting and profound and informed.
Bring it on. Oh, 1 out of 3 is all right, mate. 1 out of 3 you can stay, okay? You don't have to go for the hat trick.
I'm sorry there. I was just bringing up, I suppose, to be honest, I don't really know a lot about Spice. Spice was either an aftershave or an old band from the 90s, but in terms of drug legislation, I don't think the status of a drug really makes much difference. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said about the cheapest method to forgetting your problems and your worries,
yes,
on the streets is always going to be advisable.
Or preferable, yeah. Not advisable, but preferable.
Not advisable, sorry, yeah. Preferable. I did go to festivals when they did have the legal high stands, and you see people running up and trying loads of stuff. And, you know, they were popular. But I've been to festivals since those legal high stands have gone, and people are still trying drugs. It's a black market. You know, and I know legal highs may cause damage, but there's got to be, even if it's the tiniest amount, a higher level of regulation through that means than just buying it off some guy. If you saw, I mean, I presume you have actually, but I see it on a slightly troubling regularity, particularly around Charing Cross Station here in London.
It's almost impossible to imagine why anybody would take it, whereas with other drugs, you can see, you know, you can understand laudanum. If you read your 19th century poets, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense. You can understand cannabis. If you watch Cheech and Chong, or just some sort of giggling idiots in the corner of a party or having the time of their life while everybody else is talking about house prices. You can understand even heroin when it gives you that kind of that release from reality, that sort of adventure, that jump. But when you see someone who's taken this drug, it's just so out of the ordinary.
Well, I mean, acid is a drug that you know, I've experimented with drugs in my younger years. I'll be honest with you. Some I enjoyed, some I didn't. I was lucky enough to be able to have a lot of fun with it and come out the other side of it, and it didn't really happen.
Acid is a really, really powerful drug, but if you read Timothy Leary or Aldous Huxley or even the Beatles, you recognise that a lot of people, with some justification, believe that it has kind of artistic properties, and it turn on, tune in, drop out. It frees the mind, but not spice, mate. You see someone curled up in a puddle of their own pee in the doorway of an abandoned bank, and you sort of think, I mean, why would anyone take it? So it's the desolation of their existence that leads them to take it, which means that the legislation, the legality, as you say, is completely irrelevant to their lifestyle choices, to their decisions, and they are being completely mullered and exploited by dealers who are making, what, £2.50 per deal?
I think, yeah, absolutely. As you said earlier, you've hit the nail on the head. It really comes down to the whole reform of the drug system and the whole war on drugs. Because
yes.
The war on drugs doesn't work. It's not working. You know, cannabis, to be honest, I smoke cannabis, and my missus, she smokes cannabis, and we grow cannabis at home. And the reason she smokes cannabis is because she suffers from Crohn's disease. So we've managed to import a strain from Holland, which gives us her relief from those symptoms.
And you are breaking the law. I can't let that go unremarked. But equally, you highlight a strong argument to why the law perhaps is an ass on this issue.
But I would have, if I was gay many moons ago, I would have been breaking the law. So you know, there is that element that the law is effective. You know, or if I was black in 100 odd years ago in America, I've been doing something wrong. So.
Yeah, some parts of America, mate, you still are, judging by some of the recent developments in that blighted nation.
I mean, collectively as a whole, with the drug legislation, it needs to be rectified and looked at it with fresh eyes, doesn't it?
Here's a trick. Here's the thing. Hang on. I just, if you had to write the rule on what should be legal and what shouldn't be legal, I don't think anybody could do that, and that should be the reason why perhaps the whole shebang needs to be torn up and redrawn.
I agree.
What happened a couple of years ago? Quickly, I've got a lot of calls waiting.
Oh, you've dazzled me and I've lost my train of thought now.
Short-term memory shot to pieces, isn't it, Dave?
It's all that kind of
It's 12:41. James is in Reading. James, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'm first-time caller.
Welcome.
I was just looking for the other caller that's just gone.
Yeah.
Some people's perception of spice is bad, well, most people. But I think it's more in moderation. I used to smoke cannabis a lot. I don't smoke any cannabis anymore. I just strictly smoke spice. And it all depends on how much you use. If you smoke too much of it, then yeah, it does send you a bit loopy. But if you do it in moderation, it's not as bad as everybody makes out.
Well, I mean, we're going to have different levels of resistance, and everybody's going to have different, tolerance levels. And far be it from me to point towards a Daily Mail investigation as incontrovertible evidence that you're wrong. But they have spoken to people who describe taking one drag and being hooked. I spoke to a fellow who tried it in jail, and he was in jail for importing quite serious amounts of Class A drugs, but he'd never come across spice before.
That was where I first experienced it.
In prison?
When I went to prison, yes. Because it's a lot easier to get that than it is to get cannabis in there.
Why?
The smell, it doesn't smell.
Right.
And it's just, I don't really know the reason why it's easier to get in there, but if you ask for a couple of grams of spice, that can easily be allocated, whereas a couple of grams of cannabis is a lot harder to get hold of and a lot more money.
I was going to say it's a lot cheaper, presumably, and
yes,
a couple of grams of spice would go a lot further than a couple of grams of cannabis, or not?
It would, yeah.
Well, that's why then.
A whole lot, and then you'd be jumping off the wing and bouncing all around the prison.
But if you, as you say, take it moderate, I'm not entirely comfortable with that, but I don't know whether I can argue with you, given that you take the stuff and I don't. So why do you still take it now you're no longer in prison? Is it for economic reasons, or do you prefer it?
I just prefer it. I mean, my habit before I went in prison on cannabis was between £200 to £300 a week. Now, spice, it's around £5 a week. So it's a lot cheaper.
Oh, crikey. And you're kind of out of it for a similar amount of time?
I mean, sometimes when you take it, it does send you a bit delay. I mean, I've beat the wife before, and that was one time, and I stopped smoking it for a while, but I blacked her eyes, busted her lip, and she actually had me arrested for it.
Good.
But I'm a bad man, so that's how
No, I don't. When I say good, I mean I'm glad that she went down the path that she went down. And I don't know whether you're a bad man or not. You did a very bad thing, but it doesn't sound to me as if Spice is likely to be part of your recovery process, mate. It really isn't. But I thank you for your honesty. Up to a point. It's coming up to 1:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. This relationship between intoxication and drugs. If you always, you know me, I've got this obsession, and I never find them. His obsession with finding the key that unlocks every argument forever. I found a few over the years. A couple on sex education for children is quite a strong one. When you say, well, if a child is being abused at home and being told by somebody that it's not abuse, it's perfectly normal and it's happening to everybody else, how are they going to find out that they're being abused unless somebody tells them at school? Unless it is beholden upon the state to give them proper education at school, and then that should close down all arguments. It doesn't, of course, because people have astonishing powers of self-delusion and stubbornness. But that's one example. And on this, why wouldn't you legalise? Who doesn't want drugs to be legalised? Answer: right-wing politicians and gangsters. So, whose side are you on? Right-wing politicians and drug dealers, or everybody else? And if you needed to go further, you'd probably say, all right, write me a line now that describes substances that should be illegal. Okay? Now let's try that for the last 15 minutes of the programme. Write me a line now that describes substances that should be illegal or only available on prescription. That's what you need to do. Describe to me the qualities, the properties that all substances which should be illegal have. And I don't think you can. I've tried, but I don't think you can. It's 12:46. We're talking about drugs in a slightly different way from how we've talked about them in the past, largely because we are discussing an issue that we know absolutely nothing about, which is the so-called spice. And, well, not absolutely nothing, but not as much as I do about other issues, other drugs, actually. But some of the stuff we've learned explains why people at the bottom of a rock bottom take it. It is just cheap oblivion. Last fella was a slightly tragic figure. I didn't like it when he went away describing himself as a bad man, because I think that kind of self-image perhaps sometimes explains why people end up doing themselves harm. If you're going to really hurt yourself by putting some of this stuff into your system, then it speaks of not loving yourself very much. And if you don't love yourself very much, it's very hard for other people to love you. But yeah, I'm possibly being a little bit too touchy-feely on that one. What I want you to try to do, if you can, and this isn't, if you've already rung in, I'm still going to talk to you, but if you want to get on before 1 o'clock, I bet you can't write a line, single line or two, that describes the properties a substance should have in order to be rendered illegal. Because if we can't do that, then we're just faffing about, aren't we? Tom's in Surbiton. Tom, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello, Tom.
I think it's a really, really complicated question, obviously.
For sure.
But if we start, legalising certain drugs, I feel it's going to be a very slippery slope with regards to other drugs. My sort of viewpoint, as someone who's suffered from addiction quite severely to spice, it's...
Really?
It's... Yeah, I mean, I was smoking probably 3 or 4 grams of it a day for about a year. Thankfully, I wasn't homeless. So, you're saying, why would people want to put that into your body? It's just about oblivion. It's not people who have addictive tendencies and stuff. I got completely hooked on it. And thankfully, I managed to get off it because it was illegalised.
Because you couldn't go out and buy it from a shop round the corner?
Because I couldn't go out and buy it from the shop round the corner. But if I was on the street and someone had come up to me and said, I've got a little bit of spice here, I'll give you this for £3.
Of course.
I would have done it immediately. And I think that one issue is that a lot of people in this world still don't see addiction as a proper illness.
No, that's true.
And it really is. I mean, I've been to rehab, and I really needed that.
Yes.
I think if someone's going to get caught with cocaine or heroin on the street, I don't think they should necessarily be arrested for possession. I think the drugs should be taken off them, destroyed, and they should be put on some sort of addictive therapy program or something.
And yet a huge number of people that use, to a lesser extent, heroin, but not. I mean, it's not a negligible number, and a large number of people who use cocaine would not consider themselves to be, and wouldn't fit most criteria of addiction.
No, and you're completely right. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who do use things recreationally and not habitually.
Oh, that's the language.
I think rather than prosecuting the habitual users, we should. I know we're struggling with money in the country, but we really need to battle addiction at the core rather than punishing people for just being ill.
And when you look at the recidivist rates for drug-addicted people on things like housebreaking and burglary, it would actually pay for itself pretty quickly, but it would be very hard politically to get past the usual suspects in the House of Commons and the British media. I tell you what, you can have a crack at answering this then, as somebody whose addiction to spice was broken only by criminalisation. What would you criminalise? What qualities would you render illegal? So what criteria must a substance fit to be criminalised in your purview?
I generally think that, I mean, when you're so addicted to something, you will really do anything to get it. You'll do illogical things. You'll do things that could harm other people. I think if anything has the potential to be detrimentally addictive, it should be something that's got a big yellow tape round it. And, should have laws enforced around it. But then if people do get caught breaking those laws, I think they should be seen less as criminals and more as victims of an illness.
It's a bit of a lazy response from me, but it's, I think, a fully valid one, because you'd have to put alcohol in that category, wouldn't you?
I mean, yeah, without question, which is why it's such a complicated issue. I mean, I'm also an alcoholic, I do smoke a bit of dope. But that has no impact on my life whatsoever. But when I've been in active alcoholism, I've done some really terrible things.
Yes, I'm sure. So that's an evolution of your theory in a way, the idea that it's not just its capacity to be addictive, which, many people think cannabis has that as well. It's something to do with how low the addiction can bring you, and that's going to be very much in the eye of the user, isn't it? Because there'll be functioning alcoholics who've never done anything shameful in their lives, but who are enslaved to alcohol in the same way chemically that you are, or have been.
Yeah, entirely.
Yeah, you weren't kidding, were you, when you said it was quite a complicated issue, Tom? How are you getting on? Are you dry at the moment? Are you?
Yeah, I'm actually just.
Oh, we lost the phone line. Oh no, that's almost like a dum 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 dum. Good. He sounded it, didn't he? Sounded it like he was in a good place. 12:55 is the time. Make sure he's all right, will you? Adam is in crew. Adam, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Carry on.
Well, basically, I would like to say, I think any drugs that should be legalised should be the ones in their natural form. Not any drugs that's made in the lab should be legalised, because obviously we've seen the effect of things like spice. Obviously, that is duplicated to implicate the effect of natural drugs.
Yes.
How would it make it legal to sell natural drugs, or drugs that are manipulated to reflect natural drugs, and then ban the illegal ones? For me, my reason is that would be a profit one.
So LSD would be illegal?
Yeah.
But poisonous mushrooms wouldn't be?
Well, because these are the things that are natural, and the thing we should focus on, I think, is the education of how people use this drug. Because there is other countries that use.
Yeah, I think this works with regard to spice, but it doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't really work with regard to other drugs. So ecstasy would be illegal in your world, but I'm trying to think of something that sort of weird South American drugs that can send you tripping off your nut for about 3 weeks straight. They'd be legal because they know stuff you get out of a cactus that sends you absolutely bonkers. That would be legal, but ecstasy, which just makes you want to hug everybody for 5 or 6 hours, would be illegal.
Well, my argument is, if that's the case, then why is it that we know already alcohol is killing more people than maybe people...
Yeah, I know the alcohol argument can be used very powerfully because I use it myself, but it's not relevant to what you're saying, because what you'd also be doing is completely overlooking the fact that most of the most efficient medicines on the planet have been refined, if not created, in laboratories, not in botanical gardens.
Well, I'll give you another example, maybe, James.
Go on.
Well, I'll give you another example. Look at opium, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, this country went to war into Afghanistan to stop the Taliban, to stop to stop them producing and supplying everything. And then what do we do next? We start growing ourselves. So that's defeating the object. We're saying the drugs goes in the black market. Since we've been to war, the drugs problem hasn't stopped. I think when I looked at one of the researchers in America, heroin is killing more people than anything else.
Well, opioids are. It's not. I mean, you're right. I mean, the opioid crisis in America is absolutely huge, but I suppose they've got enough on their plate to worry about at the moment, but they should really be worrying about that a lot more than they are. You're close to something there, but I don't think the kind of herbal argument is going to be quite enough to disprove my point or my claim that it's impossible to write a cohesive sentence or even paragraph that describes the properties of a substance that a society should criminalise. Because you've always got the, oh yeah, what about lager? Or, oh yeah, what about mushrooms? Or, oh yeah, what about this? What about that response? That's almost it. Adam, thank you so much for the call. Dan's in Croydon. Dan, I know you've been a copper for 20 years, but I've only got 40 seconds left. Do your best with it.
Alcohol requires greater supervision than any other drug in the last 28 years that I've come across. I've seen more horror inspired by that particular drug than any other drug I've ever come across.
What would you do to so-called illegal drugs? Well, not illegal, so-called. What would you do to drugs that are currently illegal?
It's not the view of the Metropolitan Police Force, but it's certainly mine. I really can't see what increased policing of drugs. I don't know what it really brings to the party anymore. I mean,
no, it uses up a lot of money, uses up manpower, and it essentially exacerbates problems. I remember when I got into some bother as a kid, and the investigating officer told my father that she thought it should be legal. And I'll tell you what, the look on my dad's face, it's almost worth getting arrested for. It's coming up to 1 o'clock. That's it from me for another week. We'll do it all again on Monday from 10.
We have too much of a tolerance for drug use, psychologically, politically, morally. We need to say, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no, don't do it.
That was Attorney General Jeff Sessions earlier this year, voicing his long-held hardline view on drugs and drug users. In May, he signaled his eagerness to rejoin the nation's old-style war on drugs with a memo that orders federal prosecutors to pursue the harshest possible punishment against drug offenders, including mandatory minimum sentences.
We are returning to the enforcement of the laws as passed by Congress, plain and simple. If you are a drug trafficker, we will not look the other way.
On the premise that big prison populations keep our nation safer, Sessions' memo cancels an Obama-era policy that reduced sentences for nonviolent drug offenders. This initiative flies in the face of data that suggests that the criminal justice system disproportionately penalizes Black and Latino drug offenders and utterly rejects the idea that the nation has lost its $1 trillion war on drugs. This, despite the fact that there is an ongoing opioid catastrophe in America.
It would be hard to overestimate the magnitude of this problem.
Debbie Dowell is a senior medical advisor at the Centers for Disease Control.
We saw drug overdose in the United States more than double, and opioid-related overdose more than triple.
On average, 91 Americans overdose on heroin or prescription painkillers like Percocet and OxyContin every day. That is clear. What is not clear, amid conflicting narratives, ideologies, medical protocols, and laws, is the very nature of the abuse, or even of drug addiction itself. The government defines it as a chronic brain disease of compulsive use, quote, despite harmful consequences. But the overwhelming majority of illegal drug users do not meet that standard. This week, we devote the show to media depictions of drugs and drug users, because, as you'll hear, in politics and journalism, the drug threat often stands in for fear of the other. In pop culture, there's less ambiguity. Drugs are merely vehicles for comedy or drama.
Ah, you can smoke this?
Oh, yeah, man.
No.
What you do is you light all three ends at the same time.
Really?
And then the smoke converges, creating a trifecta of joint smoking power.
You produce a meth that's 70% pure, if you're lucky. What I produce is 99.1% pure.
Take the best orgasm you ever had, multiply it by 1,000 and you're still nowhere near it. When you're on junk, you've only one worry, scoring.
As I said, it's not hard to suss out distortions of drug use and drug users in pop culture. It's a lot trickier in political pronouncements and news coverage. So we begin with the latest in our series of breaking news consumers' handbooks, Drugs Edition.
As the heroin problem continues to get worse, so do the crimes associated with it.
Most shocking, many new users are turning to heroin because they became addicted to legally prescribed painkillers.
In so many communities across this country, the needles are everywhere.
Heroin. H. Horace Smack. In the 60s, we were told it was an inner-city African-American drug. Now, a white rural drug. Did you know that at least half of heroin users nowadays inhale it instead of injecting it? Probably not, because the image of the needle on the ground or in the arm is so arresting, so familiar. But the current heroin epidemic, a headline-grabbing subject, deserves a closer look. So we'll correct a few assumptions. Point 1. Heroin use has certainly increased, but contrary to what you may have seen or heard, it is used far less than, say, marijuana or cocaine, ecstasy, or prescription painkillers. The alarming news is the sharp rise in heroin overdose deaths since the 2000s. That's what troubles and perplexes public health officials the most. Debbie Dowell of the Centers for Disease Control.
In 2015, the last year for which we have numbers, we saw 12,989 deaths related to heroin in the United States.
Note that Dowell said related to heroin. Point 2, overdose deaths don't usually stem from just one drug. The majority involve multiple substances like heroin and alcohol, or OxyContin and alcohol and Tylenol. Public health officials and journalists could offer news consumers a little more clarity. So beware reports like this.
It's the one drug that police officers dread above all others, not crack, heroin, or even prescription pills. We're talking about PCP.
People used to buy the powdered form called angel dust. Now $70 gets you a vial filled with liquid to make dippers. Marijuana and cigarettes dipped into a potent cocktail including ether and embalming fluid.
Point 3, most new drugs are not new. Often they're just slight variations on or combinations of substances we already knew about, with maybe a slangy new name. Think powder cocaine and crack, or Molly, the now popular pure form of the 80s party drug, ecstasy. The novelty offers the media a chance to claim the drug is making a more potent comeback, which is sometimes true, often not. Remember the hysteria over so-called bath salts. This new class of drugs triggered paranoia in a small number of users and a large number of news organizations.
Bath salts look like their name, but are a strong concoction similar to amphetamines or cocaine. The effects are like no drug on earth.
And we have new video out tonight from that bizarre attack in Miami where a man high on bath salts eats a homeless man's face.
People believed that bath salts caused this guy to eat the face off of this other guy, when in fact bath salts had nothing to do with it.
Dr. Carl Hart is chair of the psychology department at Columbia University and author of High Price, a neuroscientist's journey of self-discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society.
The only thing that was in the guy's system was THC, but the THC could have been there for some longer period of time, so we're not even clear if the guy was intoxicated from marijuana. These kind of stories create mythologies around drugs, and they seep into our drug education and law enforcement education. And we wonder why police officers think that someone on bath salts or PCP is so dangerous or unaffected by bullets. It's because of this misinformation. When you start to see those kind of buzzwords, a few hits and you're addicted. Put down the article, because either the author is an idiot or the author thinks that you are an idiot.
Thus, point 4. Remember the boy who cried wolf. Maya Solovitz, author of Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, has written about addiction and drug policy for almost 30 years.
If you take an illegal drug that you have been told is the most horrifying bad thing and that you will become a terrible person overnight if you do this, and that doesn't happen, then you will be much more skeptical of the messages about the drugs that are actually a lot more harmful.
Such as fentanyl, a synthetic opioid often used as an anesthetic.
Fentanyl, the powerful painkiller that officially killed Prince. 100 times more powerful than morphine.
This, the media have right. From 2014 to 2015, the death rate by synthetic opioids like fentanyl increased by 72.2%. But when the media depict every drug as extremely lethal, the real killers get short shrift. So why are we awash in so much imprecise, hyperbolic coverage? Which brings us to point 5, one that appears in every edition of our News Consumers Guides. Consider the source. For instance, be wary of stories that rely heavily on law enforcement quotes, unless they're talking about police work.
Police are not pharmacologists. They are not experts in statistics or in addiction. If we had a MD talking about here's the best way to police this particular precinct, I think people would have a problem with that. The other problem with looking at addiction through the police's view is that police see people who are having problems with drugs. This is a minority among people who use drugs. And it gives a perception that all people who use drugs are criminals, all people who use drugs are violent, all people who use drugs become addicted. And this is actually a sampling bias, basically.
Likewise, just because someone has experience with addiction does not necessarily make them an expert on addiction.
People with addiction should certainly be seen as experts on their own addiction and their own experience of addiction. But unfortunately, the addictions field has had this idea that if you've got 90 days free of drugs, you are an expert and you can go on the media and talk about this as though you speak for everybody with addiction. And we wouldn't do that with any other group of people.
Point 6. As always, be suspicious of simplistic finger-pointing narratives.
The medical community has been overprescribing opioid pain medicines, and it led to parallel increases in rates of addiction and overdose.
In recent years, much of the blame for the overdose crisis has been heaped on doctors, portrayed as negligent Dr. Feelgoods indiscriminately pushing painkillers, which, for one thing, obscures the role of Big Pharma and of the simple shortcomings of medical education. With data provided by drug makers, doctors were misled to believe that the addictive rate of opioids for certain patients was less than 1%. Recent studies have found that risk to be 8 to 24 times greater. Furthermore, says Solovitz, the genesis of addiction is seldom in the doctor's office.
90% of all addiction starts in the teens and 20s. And thankfully, most people in their teens and 20s don't tend to have back pain. So yes, it is possible for teens to get exposed via medical use, and that certainly happens. But what typically happens is about 2/3 of them are using someone else's prescription. They're getting it out of their parents' medicine cabinet. They're getting it from a friend. They're getting it from a drug dealer. They are not getting it from a doctor. And so the idea that doctors directly caused this is a little more complicated.
All of which leads to the final, most fundamental caution. Point 7, demonizing the drug alone ignores the underlying problems.
We can't talk about the opioid problem without talking about the way the middle class in America itself is threatened, the way people feel a real sense of despair and hopelessness.
Solovitz points out that 2/3 of the people who use painkillers generally don't enjoy the experience. But among the third that do feel the euphoric effects of opioids, those with stable lives tend to weigh the risks against the rewards, and they choose friendships, family time, and professional ambition over the drug.
That's what happens if your life is in a good place when you get exposed to these drugs. If your life isn't in a good place, if you have a history of childhood trauma, which about 2/3 of people with addiction do, if you have mental illness, which about 50% of people with addiction do, if you have some combination of that and some type of despair or you're unemployed, that's when opioids become a risk.
Despair, alas, like illegal drugs themselves, is not in short supply. What is in short supply is nuance, context, and restraint in telling the story of a plague and its grim toll.